Hello and welcome to episode 333 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this fine April morning, Bill?
I'm doing well, Seth. I'm wearing my Navy baseball shirt, and no, that does not mean I was a good enough baseball player to play for the Navy team. Heck, I wasn't even good enough to play for my varsity high school team, but I got this shirt when I played on an alumni team. I was the oldest guy on the Naval Academy alumni team by 10 years, and they let me play and let me play third base, frankly, until I tore my rotator cuff throwing from third to first. That's the surgery I just had 10 years later. I had that surgery last September to repair the rotator cuff, and it's doing pretty well, Seth.
Well, that's
But
good.
in
That's
honor
good.
of baseball season, I'm wearing the shirt.
I too was a ball player, but my playing days ended in high school, and I have yet to pick up the gloves since, and probably won't ever again. So it
I
was
used to
enjoyable
love
while I did too,
Yeah.
until you get tired of it after a while.
The smell of the grass, the smell of the leather glove, I just immersed myself in it. I was living in it. I actually hit a home run in San Diego Padres Park, but that's a story for a different day.
Damn, yeah. I was a hurler. I was a pitcher, so I didn't get to bat too many times, but that's besides the point. Before we get started, we do, as we have always done, ask you to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and or audio channel or wherever it is that you're receiving this information from. It does help other people find our stuff. So especially on YouTube, if you are watching there, please do hit that like and subscribe button. If you have already done so, thank you very much. Now on with the show. Now, Bill, this is going to be, as we're nearing the end of season 3, which is of course 1944, as you're keenly aware, we wrapped up the Leyte land invasion last week with John McManus, and that ends in December of 1944. So we're kind of hanging out here in the wind, and we need to wrap up 44 because 1944 was unlike any other year of the Pacific War, any other year of the Pacific War before or after. I mean, it was such a tremendous difference in the way things unfolded, and there's a bunch of reasons why. So
Yeah.
fair warning to everyone here watching and or listening. Bill and I are doing this completely off the cuff. We made a couple of little, like, here we should talk about A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that is it. So we are going off the cuff. So God help us both and bear with us as we go. But Bill, in the likes of David Letterman, you came up with a list, a list of things that are the reasons why 1944 does what 1944 does for the United States. You wanna start us off here?
Yeah, sure. This is my top 4 list. I think David Letterman has the copyright on top 10 lists, but this is my top 4 lists of reasons we're beating the Japanese at the end of 1944. And here we go. So number 4, better leadership than the Japanese. Now, let's go through a couple of these key leaders, Seth. The first one I'll talk about is Admiral King. Now, towards the end of 1944, King is highly agitated, as he's been throughout his life, about the fact he keeps going to these meetings with the Brits, the combined chiefs of staff, not the joint chiefs of staff. And each of these meetings, he is outranked because the Brits, the First Sea Lord has a rank, it's called Admiral of the Fleet, and technically 5-star. And so the Brits take this rank seriously and believe that they should have final say on the conduct of the war. And this infuriates King. And so King's been pushing for a 5-star U.S. rank from the beginning of the war, from the time he became Commandant and CNO. And he finally succeeds. So this is the detail. People really don't know that it was King's push, Seth, that caused the creation of the rank. In fact, Carl Vinson wasn't satisfied, Senator Carl Vinson wasn't satisfied that the United States would be equal to the Brits. he wanted us to be senior to the Brits. So he wanted to create a 6-star rank that was opposed by the Joint Chiefs. What do you think about Admiral King at this point in the war, Seth?
King's done a lot of good. King has done a lot of good. He's also made a few mistakes here and there, but by and large, when it comes to the Pacific War, because again, we're going to hear, the U-boat war. Well, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about Pacific War. He's done just about everything that he needed to do. He's pushed, relentlessly to prosecute the war in the way he wants to prosecute the war, which is, of course, to say the Central Pacific Drive. And we've made this abundantly clear a gazillion times that the Central Pacific Drive was the drive that, frankly, won the war, and it did. It was something that had been designed to an extent, obviously Warplane and Orange Rainbow, all those years and years and years before World War II ever began. But King takes that boilerplate, if you will, and he prosecutes the war in that manner. There's obviously a few sidesteps here and there, but by and large, he does an exceptional job of maintaining that forward prosecution of the war, that forward flow that starts at Guadalcanal and brings us all the way. Now we're at the end of 1944. And admittedly, we're doing the Philippines, but even before then, up to Peleliu, which was, as we both know, a disaster. But it's all part of that Central Pacific Drive. And, again, you look at the calendar and we're in December 44 here, almost January 45. And the brakes have been put on that Central Pacific Drive after Peleliu. And we don't see anything again until February 45 at a little place called Iwo Jima. And we'll obviously get to that in spades later. But King has done an absolutely fantastic job. If you look back at everything that's happened, by and large, in terms of supplies, and I know we'll get to that in a little bit in logistics, and we'll get to that too. Ship design, all this stuff, all this stuff. King has his fingers in all of it, and he's running the Navy show. Yes, it's Admiral Chester Nimitz's sink pack. Yes, it's Raymond Spruance. Yes, it's Bill Halsey. But they're all taking orders from one cat, and that one cat is Ernest J. King.
Yeah, and Ernest J. King was taking orders from two cats. And that is FDR. We don't have to talk about him. But somebody we haven't talked about much at all, but we have to, is Admiral Leahy. Now,
yes,
Admiral William Leahy he graduated in the 1800s from Annapolis, and he'd been in every war from the Spanish-American War on through World War II. He was actually retired when Pearl Harbor happened, and he was serving as the ambassador to France. And it was actually George Marshall. Vichy France, right? Yeah. It was actually George Marshall who told FDR, we really ought to have a chief of staff of the entire military. And to show you that I'm not, posturing for a job, I think it ought to be Admiral Leahy. I think you ought to call him back to active duty and make him the chief of staff. And FDR loved the idea so much. He'd known Leahy since he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He loved the idea so much that not only did he bring him back to make him chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff rather than chief of staff of the entire military, he also made him his chief of staff, which made him the second most powerful man in the country. And when they did approve the 5-star rank, he was the first 5-star admiral or 5-star of any service in United States history. So what comes to mind when you think of Admiral Leahy, Seth?
Two things. One, a gentleman. Like the guy was, he was legitimately the personification of an officer and a gentleman. He was an outstanding human being, really. And two, an organizer. My goodness gracious. The guy had organizational skills unlike any other human being on the United States side in World War II. Honest to God. If you look at the things that he walks into the job of which you just described, not long after Pearl Harbor. I mean, I forget exactly. Do you remember what month it is? I don't remember, but it's not long after Pearl.
Yeah, it was in 43. I'm thinking February, March 43. I think it was. So I'm sorry, 42.
42.
Yeah. It was after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
I could look it up here. We got the book. But
February, speaking of which, Bill, hold that book back up again. Guys, you're always asking for books. If you haven't read this thing, this is a freaking awesome read. The Admirals by Walter Bornemann. It is a fantastic book. It talks about Leahy, King, Nimitz, and Halsey. I think that's it, right? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
And yeah,
just the
all
five
five
stars.
stars. Yeah, all the five stars.
Yeah.
And it's really, really, really good. It's not all about World War II. I'd say probably 60% of it is, but
Yeah.
it's really, really good. It reads like a novel. Yeah, honestly, it's like
Mhm.
one of those ones you can't put down. It's really, really good. Very good book.
If I'm
But
holding
anyway,
up books, it's the one on King, by the way, and Thomas Buell's Master of Sea Power. Um, those are the only books I brought, so it's up to the studio. So it's the only ones I'm holding up today. But I agree with you. Leahy was he was an incredible. I mean, keep in mind, he didn't just manage the three because the Marine Corps wasn't on the Joint Chiefs of Staff yet. I don't think 1944.
no, no.
He didn't just manage the three Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marshall, King, and Hap Arnold. He managed Eisenhower. He managed, to some extent, MacArthur, and that flowed through George Marshall, of course, as did Eisenhower technically. But there's a lot of man. He was a master juggler.
Well,
He had to keep. Go ahead.
you say he managed. He didn't manage those. I think I'd like to say he kind of deflected them. he,
Maybe that's
he
better.
played
Yeah.
handball with them because you're
Mhm.
exactly right. They answered to George Marshall, but as we both know and everybody knows, Max MacArthur's reaches beyond George Marshall many,
Mhm.
many, many, many times, and Leahy's the one up there, in FDR's hip pocket, especially, at that meeting in Pearl Harbor,
Mhm.
before the Philippine operation and all this other jazz. So yeah, I'd say
Where
he's a handball
where Nimitz is
player.
holding that 9 foot long pointer, pointing at
Yes,
some random spot on the map.
right.
It's a kind of a humorous photograph. That pointer is so long. They
Yeah.
didn't have laser pointers in those days, guys. Go ahead. But yeah, Leahy was he really was the second most powerful man in the country during
Yeah.
the war.
Yeah. And he
And the
was
vice president was, there's the old saying, vice presidents no better than a warm bucket of spit. And that was even true during the war.
he he was widely respected too. And we do need to do an episode, and this is not it, but we do need to do an episode on Bill Leahy because he's really a fascinating dude. Um, and his wartime contributions, exactly to your point, Bill, are largely unknown, but he was almost universally liked. Like, there
Mhm.
wasn't hardly, I can't think of anybody with the exception of maybe MacArthur, and even Mac liked him because they got on amicably. Um, that didn't like and respect Bill Leahy to the nth degree. So yeah, he's
Mhm.
definitely somebody we're going to tackle in our
Yeah.
upcoming season for sure.
I mean, George Marshall recommended he be recalled to active duty. I mean, that kind of tells you what high regard he was held. All right. So the next guy on my list, of course, you can't, is going to be obvious. It's Nimitz. And Nimitz, as we said repeatedly during the season, Seth tripped on Peleliu. But the good news about Nimitz was he continued learning. And Trent Hohn's book, Learning War, I think, talks about this a lot. And he had his fingerprints all over doctrinal, tactical, operational equipment improvements that occurred in theater during the war, Seth.
Yeah, I think Nimitz's shining moment in 44 is the beginning of the year. Not that I mean, we all
Mhm.
know Peleliu's a disaster, but his shining moment to me personally is January 1944 when they're moving into the Marshall Islands and he sidesteps his advisors and say, we ought to take, I forget which island it was. They were,
Kwajalein.
well, that's the one we do take, but there was
Mm.
another one that they said we ought to take this, and he's like, we're gonna
Yeah.
hit him, use the old MacArthur, say hit them where they ain't, and he puts the gas pedal down on the Central
Mhm.
Pacific Drive right after Tarawa. Tarawa ends in November, obviously, November 1943, and I mean, we're not, taking a breath. We're just going, bam, and he's got the pedal to the floor, and he just accelerates right through. Granted, admittedly, the Marshall Islands were not as heavily defended as the Marianas were or anything like
Mhm.
that, but still, he had the tactical and strategic wherewithal to say, this is the place we need to hit, and we need to hit this specific couple of islands and we need to hit him like now. And,
Mhm.
overrules what his people are telling him that he shouldn't do, and just says, no, this is what we're going to do. And you can either be on board or not. And because this is what we're going to do. And he does it,
Mhm.
and it works. And it works,
And
marvelously. And of course, this gets us Majuro Atoll. I know we're going to talk about logistics here in a little bit, but it's one of those instances in the war that I think is often overlooked because it's sandwiched in between Tarawa and the Marianas. But the Marshalls was incredibly important, and it was Chester Nimitz that again put the foot to the floor and said, "Let's go right now," and it worked
Mhm.
out perfectly. It really did.
Yeah, it did indeed. And, he just, I would say through the Marianas, through the Turkey Shoot, his big screw up being Peleliu, but his fingerprints were all over this. He was not passive. He moves to Guam in order to try to get away from all of the entertaining he had to do in the middle of all this. This is incredible, right? And even that doesn't work. He's still being called on to entertain. Okay, so the next guy, of course, is William F. Halsey. I said that Nimitz tripped on Peleliu but continued learning. I would say Halsey tripped repeatedly and was beyond learning at this point. I don't think somebody, one of our commenters, I think aptly said that after we said in one of our prior episodes, the war had passed Halsey by. And, it was just one of those inability, lack of self-awareness, lack of ability to know what you are and are not good at, and
What you're,
then augment yourself with things that can fill in the gaps. That was his real deficiency, I think, Seth.
I think, I'm a Halsey fan. I always have been. I've,
Mhm.
I've made that abundantly clear, especially in 42. And in 43 as well. He
Oh
he
man,
does
yes.
he does an exceptional job. But again, look at the war that he's running in 42 when he comes into Guadalcanal at the darkest time and picks us up out of the trash heap, and and and
Mhm.
and he does. I mean, everything that happens in November and in October of 42 in the seas off and the shore, frankly, for that, well, not everything, but a lot of things that happen ashore are thanks to William F. Halsey. And I mean, he really does. That is where he earns his stripes. And in 43,
100%.
going up through the Solomon's chain, all of that again, masterful job, absolutely masterful job. But what I was going to say is look at the size of the forces he was working with then.
Yeah.
The size of the forces at Guadalcanal, as we know, we're not going to get into it, they were small, a pittance compared to what we're dealing with now. And even in 43, when the fleet is growing, he's still not dealing with the size and the complexity of the operations that he's dealing with in 1944. And of course, we're talking about Leyte Gulf and
Mhm.
all the ancillary battles that go around there. But I think what he was trying to do, and this is just my personal and professional opinion, is he was trying to fight that, and we've said this before, he's trying to fight that carrier battle that he missed in 42 multiple times. And it's the first time he's led a fleet since 1942 aboard a ship. And, I think he's trying to fight the battle that he should have let his subordinates fight, is all it
Mhm.
is. There were too many
Yeah.
irons in the fire at Leyte Gulf, admittedly. And we said this in our 83,000 episodes that we did on Leyte Gulf, that, you know, he's getting conflicting intelligence reports, and it's hard to juggle all that in real time. And it truthfully
Mhm.
is, but he still makes some stupid mistakes. Lack of communication. He's got a staff, frankly, that fails him. And, I
Mhm.
just it's deficient. Those are the deficiencies, and we didn't even talk about the damn typhoons, but those are deficiencies that could have sunk him. No pun intended.
Yeah. All right. Are you familiar with the Peter Principle, Seth?
No.
Peter Principle is a business concept written by a man named Peter, where he says you get promoted if you're good until the point where you're not good anymore. And then that's when you start failing. Then you stop getting promoted. And Halsey, I think, exemplified the Peter Principle. He did so well early in the war. He finally gets promoted to the point where it's too big for him, and he does not operate at that level. Halsey does eventually get promoted to 5 stars in 1946, was it? It was after the war ended. But that there was debate about him or Spruance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, that was memorializing his early contributions. It's the only way I could think to justify it.
I agree with you 100%, because again, he earned his stripes in 42 and 43. He did not earn them in 44 and 45. And Lady Golf is not the last time we're going to see Halsey in charge of third fleet, because he's going to run third fleet again in 45 twice, I think, off the top of my head. And he ravages the coast of Japan with third fleet. He does, and there's no question. But and certain things change, I think, where he learns to let his subordinates, i.e., John McCain and Mark Mitcher, do their jobs, which is what he should have done at Lady Golf. And I will say this to my dying day: if he lets Mark Mitcher actually do what Mark Mitcher knew how to do, I don't think we're having this conversation right now, Bill.
100%. We slammed on Mark Mitcher in 42, and deservedly. But by this point, he has come into his own.
Oh, yeah.
And Nimitz's second chance really pays off here in 44, 45 Mark.
Did you have him on your list for commanding officers?
I did not. We can talk about him now or after Spruance.
Well, he's a perfect segue for the both of them, frankly, because he works for both of them. And I want to throw him in because 100%
good job.
100% correct that in 1942, he was put on the beach for the Midway debacle with Hornet, and then him lying in the after action report and all this other stuff. And then, Halsey is the one that pulls him out of the dregs and makes him aerosols, after McCain. And he screws the pooch again by, breaking the security code on the Yamamoto mission, telling the pilots who they're going after, even when he's under direct orders not to. So he does some really dumb things. And, we've had this conversation before multiple times, Bill, that he is assigned the fast carrier task force after Baldy Pownall is relieved for lack of aggressiveness. And he's put under Ray Spruance, of course, worked with him at Midway because Mitcher was running Hornet and Spruance was running Task Force 16, which included Hornet and Enterprise, of course, at Midway. And so he knows Spruance, and he also knows what happened at Midway and what Spruance did. And, we've talked about maybe a trust issue there, and maybe there was. I don't know. I never found anything that said yes or no. But the thing with Mark Mitcher is you were talking about Nimitz a few minutes ago and Halsey, lack of doing this. Mark Mitcher learns. Mark Mitcher learns what to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say, who to listen to and who not to listen to. And when he does that and he stops stepping on his own feet, he performs unbelievably well. And there is no denying that when the fast carriers are under Mark Mitcher or John McCain, who runs that force better? Just not even a contest. It's Mitcher all day long, all day. And he is our finest carrier commander of the war, in my opinion. And I don't think that's arguable. I really don't.
Yeah, I agree completely, which brings us back to Spruance. So, Spruance he is as diametrically opposed to Halsey in personality as you could possibly get. In fact, he is so the opposite of Halsey that he almost lacks personality. If you try to describe, we had, I had Spruance's grandkids on one of our episodes a year ago or so, and they described him as, having a sense of humor, but very dry and very hidden, and a playfulness that had to be coaxed out, but very set in his ways and eats the same thing for lunch every day, kind of like you, I guess. And just, and so on and so forth. But brilliant, right? Had that mind that can do these things, that could learn. Spruance obviously was not selected for 5th star, but here's a fun fact. There's a bit of World War II trivia for you folks, that Congress agreed to pay him as if he were a 5-star, even though he wasn't. And so I guess that made it a little bit easier for him.
Yeah, he is exactly like you described him. He's the exact opposite of William F. Halsey. He's riding the beach too, after Midway. And of course, he's Nimitz's chief of staff, and it was chief of staff, or
Yeah, he was
yeah,
chief of
yeah,
staff.
chief of
Yeah.
staff. Yeah, he's Nimitz's chief of staff, and then of course Nimitz, lets him go and run what is then, Fifth Fleet, um, Task Force 58. But he proves himself. He learns too, though. He
Hmm.
doesn't. He's another one. Good officers learn. They don't think they know everything. They learn as they go along. As Parshall always says, always learning, and that's the truth. If you're not, then you're doing something wrong. But it's he learns how to operate the fast carriers as well, and how to operate this enormous fleet that is put to sea in 1944, starting at Taro in 43, and then going all the way through 44. And it just grows like a gremlin. It just gets
Hmm.
huge, rapidly in 1944. And Spruance learns, and he also learns to trust. And this is what we were talking about with Mark Mitcher. He learns to trust Mark Mitcher. And if nothing else, Spruance is a guy who's going to adhere to the rules every single time. He's not a risk taker. He's not.
Hmm.
Find me a time when he takes a real risk, with the exception of stupidly riding the Iowa and the New Jersey, chasing after a destroyer and a cruiser off a truck, which was foolishness. But
Yeah.
regardless of that, he's a guy that trusts his subordinates. And there was a conversation we had about him holding the reins back on Mitcher at Phil C, and not
Hmm.
letting Mitcher chase the carriers, and whether that was a good decision or whether it was a trust decision, or lack thereof, or whatever the case may be. He was just adhering to the rules. And by the rules, I'm talking about the orders that were given to him by Chester Nimitz, which is your
Absolutely.
job is to protect this invasion force and this beachhead that we've established on Saipan, and not to go chasing the enemy fleet. Now, however, the enemy fleet is out there, you got to go tangle with them. And they had eventually do. And I mean, admittedly, in hindsight, we always say 2020 hindsight, or 2024 hindsight, that you're looking at it now, and maybe he should have let Mitchell go. He should have let Mitchell
Hmm.
run, but he didn't. But aside from that, that's the only thing I can point to in 44 that I'm like, yeah, maybe you should have done that. But he doesn't lose. He doesn't get
Yeah.
anybody.
Agree. Yeah, Phil C was a great victory, and he followed orders. He did exactly. Nimitz and King said that they stood up for him, and yeah, it did result in Nimitz's changing the standing orders, to use the Navy expression, following Phil C to say, if you have opportunity to go after the fleet, do it. But for the orders that were in place then, he did exactly what he was supposed to do, and I agree with everything you said. Now, before we close the door on this fifth five-star thing, here's another bit of trivia. I told you, trivia point one, Spruance was paid five-star pay, even though he was not a five-star. Trivia point two is there are some people in Congress who are upset at this business about five stars never being retired. They were treated as if they were on active duty for the rest of their lives. So what they did to get even with these terrible five stars is they froze their pay. And what that meant was by 1960, because all the active duty folks kept getting cost of living increases, as we still do today. By 1960, a one star was making about double what Nimitz was making when he died. So that's kind of another bit of trivia for you. The freezing of the five-star pay issue. All right. Go ahead, Seth.
I was going to say, the fact that you see that many five stars, including Douglas MacArthur and
Mhm.
Marshall, you see that many five stars in one period of time. That'll just kind of give you an indication as to how you know lethal those times were. Really. I mean, how many five
Oh,
stars
yeah.
have there been since then? I'll just say that.
Well, yeah, there was a little bit of scuttlebutt about it during Desert Storm, if you can believe that, for Colin Powell. And Colin Powell said he had a good historic perspective, and he could compare the size of the force that he was commanding, small C commanding, because the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff actually doesn't command anything, with the size of the force these five stars were commanding in World War II. And he said, nah, this is not appropriate. And it didn't happen. but it was amusing because I was in the National Military Command Center standing watch in those days, when all that conversation was taking place. All right, Seth, what other leaders should we talk about before we move on to number 3?
Well, I'm just trying to think of guys that we've talked about, in this season.
Mhm.
And I know we're leaving a pile of them out. I know. And I mean, there's two we got to hit on
Mhm.
specific. Well, there's about a half a dozen we could hit on, but there's two I want to hit on
Yeah.
specifically. One of which is Holland Smith. And he is put into the position in 1943 to run what becomes 5th Amphibious Corps VAC, and he fails miserably. He fails
Mhm.
miserably. Yes, we win those battles. We win those battles because of the Marines, not because of Holland Smith. And
That's
and
right.
I know we're going to get pushed back. And he's a Marine. He was a jackass, is what he was. It's straight. He was. He was. And I've said that those exact words multiple times, referring to him as he was a jackass. And he damn near ruined the relationship that had to work with the United States Army in the Marianas. And it took somebody like Roy Geiger and others to rebuild the bridges that Holland Smith, for whatever reason, decided he wanted to burn. And,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, but when the United States Army is better than 3 times your size, and God love the Corps, you got to work with the Army. You have to.
You
I'm
do.
sorry. You just
There's
do.
1.6 million soldiers in the Pacific compared to 300,000-ish Marines, as I recall. I'm
Yeah.
going from memory here. That's
Yeah.
dangerous.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
you get the idea. Everybody
Mhm.
understands what we're trying to say. And Holland Smith was just a tool. However, he is in command of one of the finest fighting forces in the entire world history, which of course is the Marine Corps in World War II. First Marine Division, Second Division, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and we haven't even talked about the Sixth yet for obvious reasons, but and the Fifth either for that matter. But some of the finest fighting forces the world has ever seen or will ever see
Mhm.
were under his command, unfortunately, under his command. Another guy we got to talk about briefly, because why not, is, of course, old dugout Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, you know, he starts out 44 doing the same kind of thing that he was doing in 43, kind of whining and pissing and moaning. But again, like good commanders, for the most part, he learns. And Mac, and I know it's going to pain you to say it, but it's the truth. By the end of 44, especially at Lady, find fault with something he did on Lady. You can't.
Yeah.
Honestly,
Yeah. Yeah.
I challenge you to do so. You cannot. I mean, the man does it absolutely perfectly, absolutely perfectly. And I never thought I would ever say that, but it's the truth. Honest to Christ,
Mhm.
historians are supposed to be objective, and it's the truth. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, Mac does a hell of a job.
Let the record show that Seth brought up MacArthur, not me. And it's not like, and before anybody say, well, MacArthur finally settled in his groove and became the general we knew he could be. Look at Korea. We're not going to talk about that,
No.
right? So, no, no, no. Korea was the general MacArthur was. This was the outlier. That's all. That's my only comment on it, right?
I,
Philippines, he did. I agree with you. I can't find fault with what he did in the
mm-mm,
Philippines. The
mm-mm.
only place I can't find fault with what he was doing. So this was the outlier.
He does some things in his biggest deal in 44, and you're going to see it again when we get to Luzon, is he claims victory before victory is actually
Achieved.
achieved. Thank you. Yeah, you saw the word I was struggling for, but
Yep.
but it's true, and he does it multiple times. And I mean, I know why he's doing it, because he was a headline hog, and he was. There's
Mhm.
no denying that. And I don't know, his subordinates, Kruger, even, who is not one of my favorite people, and Eichelberger, who
Mhm.
is one of my favorite people, were also always like, "Why in the hell are you doing this? We're still fighting here." And he
Mhm.
does that repeatedly, and it's one of the things that builds his legend, and that's why, of course, why he does it. But it's one of the things that, like, whenever we post anything about MacArthur, anything, and I'm sure we'll get it on here too, people are like, "He was the greatest general in the world." No, you're just reading the
We will
propaganda
get it.
machine. Yeah, you're reading the propaganda machine from 44. If you actually look at what happened, he did some things that it was like, yeah. But I mean, Biak comes to mind, that one,
Right.
specifically, but again, overall, in 1944, old Doug does a really, really good job. And when he gets to the Philippines and like Morotai and places like that, he does an outstanding job. And it's hard to find fault with it, aside from his mouth. Aside from that, it's
Yeah, I
hard to
agree.
find fault.
And I'm not even agreeing reluctantly. I'm happy to agree. We want him to do well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah, that's my first observation. The second observation is, Seth, if I can finish your sentences, we've been doing this too long. So, all right. So those are the two. Anything more on leadership, or should we move on to number three?
Hell, we could do, and we've done this in the past couple seasons. We've done an episode on leadership, and we could do that here
Mm,
because there's a bunch of guys: Kruger, Eichelberger,
there are, yeah,
Geiger,
Eichelberger.
you know,
Mm,
uh, uh, Rupertus. There's a bunch of guys that we could talk about and bag on, but we've done that in the individual episodes, or pile, praise, and we've done that too. So go back and
mm.
watch those if you want to. But to keep the flow going, no, Bill, I'm good to go. Rock on, man.
Okay. So number four reason we're better than the Japanese in the end of 1944 was good leadership. Number three, better training. And I'm using this word training fairly broadly here, Seth. It's clearly the issues we talked about in 43, where we were taking experienced combat pilots off of the carriers, which is a really hard thing to do, sending them back home so they could train people based on hard lessons learned, how not to get shot down, how to really do this dive bombing so it works, things like that. But more broadly, we're training submarine commanders, we're training to improve tactics. There are exceptions where things fall apart. We talked during this season about the fact that there are still people who don't know that long lance torpedoes exist. So we're not perfect, but we're continuing to learn over the course of time. And the Japanese, one could argue for reasons. I mean, they were short on manpower and things like that. It's not clear to me. There, with a few exceptions, in Philippines, maybe one of those exceptions. It's not clear to me that they were continuing to learn, Seth.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they do, and we're talking about U.S. training, but the Japanese, they learn how to fight a defensive battle. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
In
Mm-hmm.
1944, Biak, Peleliu, and again, you could say to a point Leyte, and then Luzon, and then of course, obviously Iwo and Oki, and
Ewo. Yeah.
yeah, it goes on and on. But in terms of commanding officers and training and things like that, you look at the forces that we're putting to sea and on the ground in 1944. Look at the commanding officers. This goes back to the point we just finished discussing. You've got guys now in charge of U.S. infantry divisions, Marine Corps divisions, ships, task groups, whatever the hell you want to talk about, who have been fighting since 42, and
Mm-hmm.
they've been fighting, and yeah, they've had their share of setbacks, but more often than not they're winning, and they're winning for multiple reasons, not the least of which is the sheer amount of material and logistical train that we have, which again we're going to get to in a minute. But
Mm-hmm.
it's the fact that these guys have learned the hard way, like you were saying, Bill, and they're practicing what they've learned. And I mean, I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at guys like Mark Mitcher, guys like Jocko Clark, Ted Sherman, people like that's just the Navy. And then you got, there's going to be a guy you're going to hear about for the First Marine Division coming up soon, Pedro Del Valle. Pedro Del Valle is one of the finest infantry division commanders in the war. And this dude's been doing this since 1942 at Guadalcanal. So, I mean, you've got guys who are now in charge, or will be in charge of divisions that have been doing this since 1942. And yes, they are training the people that are under them, obviously, especially if they're divisional commanders, but they've
Mm-hmm.
learned it the hard way. And for the Japanese, a lot of times we kill all their people. And the people that don't do well, or maybe even do well but get defeated, are like shelved. They're thrown in
Mm-hmm.
the trash heap, and they're shelved, and they don't get a chance to redeem themselves, with the exception of Ozawa. And even then, he's sent on a you know suicide and a sacrificial mission at Leyte Gulf. But still, how often do you hear about the same Japanese, fleet commander, with the exception of Nagumo, and he gets shelved too? So, they don't let their
Yeah.
people learn from their mistakes. As soon as they make one false step, bam, they're on the shelf. Whereas we let people step on their feet and hopefully they learn. If they don't learn, then they're gone. But, the training aspect in terms of aviators is outstanding.
Mhm.
Army and Navy and Marines. And and infantry, we just talked about that. And artillery, we've learned how to, as John says, just blanket an area with artillery fire, truckload of shells, shoot them all, and see if anything moves after that. But the way we've prosecuted offensive actions has stepped up significantly throughout the war because we've learned what works and doesn't.
Yeah. I'm going to stomp my foot on your point. The Japanese don't learn because everybody that has lessons to learn is dead.
Yeah,
Because based on the way they do their tactics. So there's nobody left alive to bring the lessons back. And that becomes one of their many great undoings. So training. So I'm going to move on then to number 2. And in fact, better logistics. John McManus do you see better logistics? There we go. John McManus, who's an Army guy, was riffing on a previous episode just a few weeks ago about how the United States Navy in 1944 never has to pull into port.
yeah,
That we can keep the ships maintained. Things break, folks. The ability to fix things while you're still underway is not a natural skill. The old joke about, we're going to build the airplane while we're flying it, or that there's a business joke. Well, the Navy was doing that with ships anyway. In
yeah,
1944, we were not just resupplying oil, water, fuel. We talked about the water ships. Yes, that was a real thing. Food, but also repair parts, so you could fix your turbine that just, the bearings went broke on
yeah.
you while you're underway. And so this was an incredible capability that did not exist in 1942, Seth.
No, I agree 100%. And I think that's almost a discussion in 2 parts.
Mhm.
One is that, you're underway or not, well, yeah, underway, but repair to the fleet. And you're really going to see this in 45. And the kamikazes is something we haven't talked about and we're going to, but the way, you always say, Bill, this is the way my mind works. This is the way my mind works. It has to be compartmentalized and I have to do things in a certain way or it's going to drive me bananas. But I mean, if you look at 45, and I know we're talking about 44, but if you look at 45 and the kamikaze damage that is done to some of the big ships, obviously, if a destroyer takes 2 or 3 kamikazes, they're going to have to go back to the yard,
Mhm.
because it's a small ship. But you see a battle wagon take a kamikaze or 2 or 3. You see a carrier, a fleet carrier, or even a light carrier take a kamikaze or 2. They might come out of the formation for a couple of days, a week, maybe even, and they're going to get repaired at Ulithi or Majuro or Saipan or one of the floating dry docks somewhere, and they're going to be right back there. And that is nothing that could have happened in 1942 or even 43 for that matter. I mean, if the ship gets hit in 42, Enterprise, with the exception of the Eastern Solomon Santa Cruz time, or even then she goes back to Pearl. But I mean, there's a few times when ships get hit, most of the time, 42, they're back in the US for months
Mhm.
at a time, months. And granted, a lot of upgrade and modernization is happening at that same time, but still, just battle damage repairs where that doesn't happen in 44. I mean, there are
Mhm.
exceptions, obviously, but generally, exactly to your point, that does not happen because it doesn't have to because of the logistical train, supply train, repair train, which is the second part of what we're talking about is the logistics. Just look at a map where all this stuff is originating from. Where's it coming from? It's coming from the Continental 48. It's coming from CONUS,
Mhm.
and they're moving it literally halfway across the freaking world to, execute these massive invasions. And everybody harps on Overlord, on D-Day, June 6, 44, is, all this, massive American material and Allied material is a proper term. And it's true. And there was. But you look at the things that happened in 44 in the Pacific, and the logistical network is
Mhm.
far more impressive in the Pacific than it ever was in the European theater when it comes to just bringing junk from the US to the battlefront. Everything from
Yeah.
16-inch shells to toilet paper. I mean, it doesn't matter, man. It's coming over here and it's getting through, this massive amount of the globe, and it's always there. It's always there. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Seth, I brought up we're doing this on the fly. As Seth said, we didn't prepare technically for this, but I have this map where Ulithi is. It's way over here on this upper map. And then down here, you can see where it is relative to everything else. And Ulithi is so built out. Maybe I have a photograph here. Let's see. I mean, here's Melcall photo. This is all in Ulithi. There's Fleet Recreation Area photo. We talk about guys going back to Ulithi for R&R. That is not a great place to do R&R. But the anchorage, we had floating dry docks in the anchorage. It was very protected waters, so you didn't have to worry about storms and things like that, storm surge affecting your ability to repair ships. This was incredibly important to us during this part of the war. And, for both repairs, a tiny bit of R&R. But the point here is that we didn't need to send the ships there. We sent them there when we wanted them to get a little downtime, do a little maintenance where you're not underway, right? Cool down the plant some and things like that. And the ability, this logistics stuff, do that logistics magic, allowed us to be very, careful, or I should say, conservative with respect to when we did send ships back. And that was just a luxury not only we never had, but no military, not just no Navy, no military in the history of the world, and I would argue ever again in future history will have that ability.
Yeah. And that's a curse and a blessing at the same time. And we
Mhm.
talked about this at Lady Golf. And even to an extent, Phil C too, because
Mhm.
Bill Halsey had a quote that, changing the drivers and leaving the horses is fine for the drivers, but it's hard on the horses. And
Yep.
I think that is a big reason why you see a lack of, I don't want to say production, but a lack of destruction from the carrier pilots in 44 is
Mhm.
because they did not stop. They did not stop. Like these guys are going, you said it perfectly, just because you're not flying combat doesn't mean you're not flying. These guys are flying every day. Some guys are flying
Mhm.
maybe every other day if they're lucky, but it's going to wear you out, man. And these guys are smoked. So the fact that they're going to Ulithi or even before that, Majuro and places like that, these huge logistical bases that literally popped out of nowhere is fine for the fleet, but it's not so good for the guys because,
No, it's not.
there's a book that's in my bag here, and I've mentioned it before. It's James Fahey's diary that he wrote aboard USS Montpelier, light cruiser Montpelier, and he was aboard this thing in 42 all the way to the end of the war. Dude never got a break, and he was a blue jacket. He was a 40 millimeter. I don't know if he was a gunner or a loader. Regardless, he was on one of the 40 millimeter guns. So he was always out there. And if you read this diary, which I highly encourage you to do, it's available on Amazon. It's there. I think it's called Pacific War Diary. But dude never got a break, and he's on a cruiser, I mean, never got a break. And so when he does get a break, which is, you know, in between watches, he's dead dog tired, and he's not flying an airplane. So he's not under even more emotional and physical stress and mental stress of flying a F6F, trying to attack Japanese ships or whatever. So, I mean, these guys, while those logistical bases helped out, they also hurt, in my opinion, too. But, it is what it is.
Yeah, from that standpoint, I think you're right. Good. And the number one reason that we're beating the Japanese in the end of 1944 is industrial base. This is my opinion, Seth.
No, I
So
agree.
why do I say that? There's the old joke that this coach is so good, he can beat you with his team, and then you can trade teams, and he'll beat you with your team. First of all, most of the time, that's not true. Secondly, 100% not true here. We had a completely different Navy in 1944 than we did when the war began. Even though, as we said before, we started our Navy buildup before the war began, when Leahy was CNO, actually, before he retired and went on to be governor of Puerto Rico, then ambassador to Vichy. We started building up the Navy, and yet we didn't have it building at the right capacity or the right capability. And both are important. Not only were we pumping ships out faster than any modern Navy has or ever will again, but we also upgraded every one of those ships with new capabilities that didn't exist when the war began. And both of them are important. I'm parsing it, categorizing it the way your brain works there, Seth. Go ahead.
No, you're 100% right. And you talk about ship. Let's talk about ships first, because that's fun.
Mhm.
Ships are cool to talk about. Look at the battle wagons. Look at when they're built. North Carolina, Washington, South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts. I think Alabama's laid down in 41. But regardless, all these ships are laid down, or at the very least laid down, or commissioned, or whatever the case may be, pre-war. Or admittedly, just in the months before the war, but regardless, these are done before World War II. Now, the Iowa classes are a little bit, that's a little bit different, but still,
Later.
and it doesn't take a week to build a battleship. It takes some time. But all these things are being prepped beforehand. Same thing with the carriers, the fleet carriers. Essex was, laid down in 41, or commissioned in what, 40, or late 42, early 43. But I mean, all those carriers are coming out. They're being pumped out in 43, 44. So, and they're all coming out with the hot stuff, the new hot stuff that you're talking about. But even aside from the capital ships, carriers, and the battle wagons, look at the cruisers we're making. Good God, we're talking about like the Cleveland class light cruisers. There were metric tons and tons, millions of tonnage of shipping that was built just in those cruisers alone. And we talked about the fighting capabilities of those things. You start seeing that in the Solomon Islands, and then of course you see it, all through the rest of the war. They built so many of them, they turned some of them into light carriers, for crying out loud. So I mean, and that's just one class of cruisers, and then you got the Hump-Team destroyers that are pumped out. The Fletcher class and Allen M. Sumner class, and different classes of destroyers that we haven't even talked about yet. And these are all pumped out of American shipyards from coast to coast in a period of really 1942 to 44, when the cruisers and the destroyers, of which there are, boatloads, no pun intended, that are put to sea in that time period. I mean, it's unbelievable. If you look at American shipbuilding, just warships, cruisers and destroyers, just in that time period, it'll blow your mind. It is unbelievable.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's no way the Japanese could keep up with this. And this is the point. I mean, as a defense industry guy, and I was a defense industry guy for 15 years after I retired from the Navy, from active duty, I can tell you that we're in trouble. What's it say about today? What it says about today is we're in trouble. One shipyard in China has 50 times the capacity of all of our American Navy shipyards combined. Yes, you heard me right, folks. One shipyard in China has 50 times the capacity of all of our American Navy shipyards combined. So, and I wrote an article called "Who's the Sleeping Giant Now?"
I read
The
it.
point is, it's China, right? So, this was a strength for us in World War II. It's a weakness for us today, and if we don't come to terms with that, we're screwed as a nation. And I hate using those words, but that's the way I feel, Seth.
I want to jump back to what we started talking about, and then I got carried away, and we didn't. Is the technological
Capability.
advance? Yes. Well,
Yeah.
the technological advances too,
Mhm.
because we mentioned it briefly, like when we talk about Ulithi and Majuro and things like that, and the ships go back to not so much at Ulithi or Majuro. When they go back to Pearl or they go back to the States, they get upgraded. What do you, a refit or an overhaul is different terminology. They're going to get, the newest, hottest radar, the newest, hottest surface search, air search, whatever the case may be, aircraft, whatever. I don't know. It depends on the type of ship. But you're looking at the stuff that we're using in 44. And we had this conversation with John and Tony Tully when we talked about Surigao Strait, the surface search radar, or the fire control radar, rather, Mark III versus
Mhm.
Mark VIII. Mark III was great for Washington off of, when she blasted Kirishima, but it's not getting the job done in 44. Whereas the ships that have Mark VIII are just slaying the Japanese at Surigao Strait. So that's that uptick of American technology that has occurred in really technically less than 18 months. You got to remember November 1942 to October 1944. Well, yeah, that's, it's more than 18 months, but that stuff has to be designed, has to be implemented, has to be put on the ships, which it
Mhm.
has. So, I mean, that's how fast our technology was progressing and advancing in that time period, which is why we were able to do the things that we were doing in 44. Just again, look at the air search radar. We're picking up picking up airplanes in 1942, 50, 60, 70 miles out if we're lucky in a good
Mhm.
day. Where in 1944, we're picking them up over 100 miles away on radar without Cap even, Cap's airborne, but I mean, they're not even, in the area. They're vectoring out there. So the technology has advanced to such a way that we talked about this at Phil C during the turkey shoot, that the Japanese can't even sniff us because we know they're coming before they ever even see our people. And we're just sitting there waiting for them and we ambush them. And it just happens over
And
and over and over again.
the same is true with AAA. The amount of
Mm.
AAA with the quad Bofors and the 20 millimeters and everything else that we put on the ships, where we made the point that the AAA here with an average Navy task group, battle group, is greater than the Germans could put up,
Yeah.
in European theater, right? And so, in every way you could look at it, whether it's sonar technology, whether it's although zero, we're going to talk about submarines in a minute, zero submarine approach, sonar, we used to call them sound approaches, but sonar approaches in modern parlance. Zero sound approaches were effective, succeeded in sinking a ship, despite all the ones we tried. But the technology for detecting submarines was substantially better in 44 than it was in 41. So from a defensive ASW standpoint, we benefit from that as well with our destroyers and destroyer escorts. So there's not communications advanced, range of aircraft advanced, and more so in Europe with fighters than in the Pacific. But when we're flying off of carriers, we really didn't need. We're going to talk about the B-29s in 1945. We're pumping on the B-29 program was more costly than the Manhattan Project. We spent more money on B-29s than we did on the Manhattan Project. Some people erroneously say we spent more money on the Norden bomb site. That's not correct. It's correct to say on the bomber program than the Manhattan Project. But there's no way, and there's no place where we were idle. We improved in every area, Seth.
Just look, if you want to, just a type example, look at the anti-aircraft suite on a battleship, an American battleship in 1942. Pick one. Pick South Dakota, Washington, or North Carolina, any one of those three, and then compare it to the end of 1944. Like how many guns they have on there. The 5-inch guns don't change. The 16-inch guns obviously don't change, but the 1.1s are gone. 40 millimeters are there now. There's 20 millimeters out. The yin yang. Go look. Just look at it. Look at the AAA suite on North Carolina at Eastern Solomons in August of 42, and then look at it again in 1944. That'll give you a rough idea of the amount of change that's just happened. And that's only on one vessel. So anyway, enough of that.
Right. Now, we started with the really high level strategic outlook here, Seth, as far as what the differences were to cause us to be winning in 1944. During our season 3, we didn't talk enough about submarines, in my viewpoint. And I say that only because I don't think you can ever talk enough about submarines. So we're going from the strategic down to the tactical right now. And one of the points we failed to make during season 3 was that on the 13th of April, 1944, our submarines were instructed to give priority to fleet destroyers as targets. Now, that is a very odd order. We'd been going almost exclusively after non-combatants, after logistic ships, ammo ships, oil tankers, things like merchant vessels, right?
Yeah.
And yet in April 1944, we said, okay, now, if you see a destroyer, do your best to sink it. What do you think that was all about, Seth?
That's all about, well, that's all about a lot of things. Number one, not the least of which is the fact that if the destroyers are there to sink submarines, that's one of their main, not their only role, obviously, but it's one of their main roles. So you kill what's trying to kill you, number one. Number two, destroyers, as we know, are the workhorses of the fleet, man. They do everything. They do everything from picking up guys up out of the water to getting in gunfights to getting, providing anti-aircraft support. I mean, again, we made this point at Surigao, or not at Surigao Strait. Well, yeah, no, we did. We made the point at Leyte Gulf that if you look at the destroyer escorts for the Japanese fleet as they're coming to fight Leyte Gulf, it's pathetic.
Something like 9 destroyers when there should have been 40?
At least. Because we sunk them all. I mean, we didn't sink them all, but we sunk a lot of them. We put a hurting on these things because we're identifying at this point. Yeah, it's great when you sink a battleship. Awesome. When you sink a battleship with a submarine, but that's in the grand scheme of things, that's just one ship. You can sink a lot of destroyers. It's going to put more of a hurt on the fleet than one battleship loss is going to be, or anything like that. Carriers maybe a little different, but still.
The merchants are still important, but it's going to take you 6, maybe 8 torpedoes to sink a carrier or a battleship. And if you could sink, and basically this is rough, but it's pretty much 1 torpedo per destroyer. So you can sink in numbers, not in tonnage, a lot more ships if you're going after the destroyers than and you're right. I mean, we put a hurting on the destroyer fleet as we had been doing all along on the merchant fleet. But the number of merchants started dwindling to the point where it was hard to find something worth sinking. We were going after junks in late 44 and 45. And so, if we're going to shift to something, do you want to spend your entire submarine load of torpedoes on 1 or 2 ships? A battleship or 2? Or do you want to basically destroy the entire escort force for a whole battle group? And that's why the order went that way. And again, I think we talked about this at a pretty high level. Total confirmed and probable Japanese naval and merchant ships sunk by submarines during the war was 1,392 for a total of 5,600,000 tons. That's 54.6% of all Japanese ships sunk during the war by all forces. So again, we have said, we haven't understated this at all, Seth, that the submarine force punched above its weight class, literally and figuratively. There were more dentists in the Navy than there were submarine officers.
Especially when you look at 44, late 44. Now I'm talking 44 as a whole, but especially late 44. When you're talking about anything post Mariana, well, anything Mariana's beyond. The reason that the Japanese, well, there's multiple reasons, but one of the main reasons is the Japanese fleet is less than eager to put to sea is the fact that they're running out of gas. They're running out of fuel. Why? Because the submarines have cut off, well, they haven't cut it off, but they're cutting off that fuel supply. They're sinking tankers. They're ravaging those sea lines of supply that are necessary to let those battleships and carriers sail. And I mean, you cannot understate the fact that if the subs aren't sinking those tankers, if they aren't sinking those troop transports that are bringing people to the Marianas, our casualties are going to be higher in Saipan or Tinian or whatever the case may be. That if they're not sinking those tankers, that there's going to be more ships that are going to put to sea more often. I mean, you can't argue that. The fact that the subs are literally sinking damn near everything that is floating and moving, and the fact that the Japanese are planning around let's not go here because this is known to be a hotbed. Or in some cases, guys like Kurita are like, the hell with it. I don't care if there's a hotbed. I got a thing to do. And he loses a couple of cruisers due to submarines before Civilian Sea. Point is, if the Japanese are planning around your submarine operations, then your submarines are really doing good work. If you got
Absolutely.
IGHQ in Tokyo saying, we can't do this because the American submarines are going to kick our ass, then you're doing some pretty good work.
Well, it's funny because late in the war, the area north and east of Luzon was known to the Japanese as the Sea of the Devil. And in 1944, a common saying in Singapore was that a person could walk from Singapore to Tokyo on American periscopes. So this is how bad 1944 was for the Japanese. Submarine deliveries to the fleet began to saturate the Western Pacific. Our submarines spent 11,700 days on offensive patrol and fired 6,092 torpedoes. 16 successful attacks were made on 2 days, April 27th and August 22nd, April 27th and August 22nd. And during the month of October 1944, 185 successful attacks were made. The most productive day of the war for the entire war for U.S. submarines was October 24th, 1944, when 20 successful attacks, 20 ships were sunk in one day, Seth.
That's a lot of sinking. That's a lot of sinking. And I mean, we've done submarine episodes previous. Most of them were in season 2 when we
Sure.
talked about Morton and O'Kane and Flucky and Medal of Honor recipients, and you did your Submarine 101, and we talked with Admiral Fargo and all that. But most of those centered around 1943, and obviously guys like Dick O'Kane and Tang, they're doing their killing in 44. Flucky's doing his killing in 44, 45. But there's a reason for that. It's because our torpedoes work. Number one. Number two, this goes back to your training thing that you were talking about. Is a lot of the skippers, even the new guys, even the new skippers that are taking brand new boats out, these guys have been trained by guys like Mush Morton and Dick O'Kane and Gene Flucky and whoever the hell else, and these guys, even though they're rookies, they're going out there and they are just slaying because they've been taught how to do so, and they have the equipment that works. They have the finest, I would argue, the finest fleet boat in the world. The Baleo class boat was, I'm sure people are going to say, this class of U-boat was better. Yeah, whatever. My money's on Baleo all day long. But, these guys are just taking the finest equipment in the world, and they're going out and they're doing, yeoman's work, literally, and sinking everything that floats. And that's something we'll tackle when we get in the next season, is the rise and even decline in sinking, because we sunk everything in 44 and 45. It's unbelievable.
100%. And I especially like the Baleo class bilge pump.
Absolutely.
Long-time listeners will appreciate the point I just made. Okay. All right. So Seth, let's talk about basically the strategic situation as in December of 1944, going into 45. Where do you think we sit here?
We're sitting in the catbird seat, really. We've kind of got everything by the tail. We're sitting at the end of this, let's just say January 1st, 1945. Let's say New Year's Day. Leyte is wrapped up. We've got one of the larger islands in the Philippine archipelago wrapped up. We're about to step off into Luzon, which has got, there's a myriad of things that go on there. And we'll obviously talk about all that, Manila being one, all the different special operations that happen in there, Cabanatuan, Los Baños, Santo Tomas, which is arguably not special ops. But regardless, there's a lot of things to talk about right there. We are right now sitting at a stage in our military operations in the Pacific where we can literally do just about anything we want to, and nobody can stop us. And that's the key, is that we can prosecute the war in any way we want to. We can take maybe not anything we want to. We've already talked about Formosa, and we could have taken Formosa. We just didn't have the stuff to do it. But I mean, we're getting ready to kick off Iwo Jima in a month. And then Okinawa follows in April of 1945. And we're still fighting in the Philippines all the way to the end of the war. But we're sitting right now, 75% done, ready to close the ring, if you will. And we're not even going to talk about the atom bomb yet. We've actually already done so, but we're not going to talk about that now. The firebombing raids are about to kick off in March of 1945, like the big firebombing raids over Tokyo. We're bombing Japan now, as early as 44. So we're doing exactly what we want when we want to do it, and the strategic situation is such that, again, like I said, we can pretty much do whatever we want to do whenever we want to do it.
Yeah, Seth, just to calibrate for me, because this is an honest question. I'm not asking you a question I know the answer to. We're 6 months downrange from Normandy. And in Europe, we are still mightily struggling. And the point you made is that in the Pacific, we could pretty much do whatever we wanted. And yet, this Pacific War ends later than the European War. And help me understand.
Okay. Without getting deep into the weeds. So if you're looking at December 1944 in the European theater, obviously the elephant in the room is the Ardennes offensive, the German Ardennes offensive, Wacht am Rhein, as it says. It puts a kink in the Allied plans in Europe for, a month. It ends in January 45, and we do wind up eliminating that bulge. But, German resistance crumbles like a house of cards. Once we get past some of their bigger cities, look, case in point, you're looking at the city of Cologne, which is a beautiful city. I've been there. If you've never been, go. It's a beautiful place. We were expecting a major fight as we're pulling up into the Cologne plain, heading into Cologne, Germany in 1945. And it ends with a whimper. I mean, we go through Cologne, whatever. We go through Cologne pretty damn fast. And not to say that we're not encountering stiff resistance in Germany, because obviously we are. There's a lot of really nasty fighting still left to go, but it all starts to tumble down the hills pretty quick. Case in point, the Germans are surrendering when they realize that this ain't going to work. Boom, I'm done, guys. I'm coming out. Japanese don't do that. We got to dig these people out of every hole and rock on Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the Philippines to get this done. It's taking a lot longer because their people don't surrender. They never give up. They're also launching attacks against our fleet, i.e. kamikaze attacks, and not just kamikazes, but that's the majority of what's launched in 45 that the Germans do not do. I mean, yeah, the Germans do have some suicide aircraft that ram our bombers and stuff like that. Yeah, that does happen, but nothing to the degree that the Japanese are doing against the 3rd or 5th Fleet, depending on who's in command, in 1945. I mean, just look at the casualty figures for the United States Navy off of Okinawa. They're startling.
Yeah, I would also throw in Europe with the Russians weren't nothing.
Oh,
the
God,
Soviets, the significant firepower they're bringing to bear along with the Brits. And, so sure, the Brits and the Aussies and Kiwis were in the Pacific, but we were carrying 80% of the burden in the Pacific by ourselves while doing everything we're doing in the Atlantic. And I pulled that number out of the air. I have no idea if that 80% is correct, but the point is, so you're right, a much more strident enemy who was willing to die in the process, who was not going to give up in the Pacific. And, we were distracted by Europe. When I say distracted, a large percentage of our resources were being expended there.
Yeah.
So as our, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, no, you're 100% right, and that the Germans were being squeezed from both sides. And I don't think people necessarily understand the sheer amount of men and materiel that the Soviets were throwing into that fight.
Yep.
They're dropping several 100,000 to 1 million people per offensive. And they're just keeping that train rolling all day long. George Patton famously said after the end of the war, we'll take on the Soviets. Homie, I don't think you want to take on the Soviets in 1945.
No.
I don't think you want to.
We got all the men and people here. Let's do it now. We're going to have to do it eventually.
I don't think you want to do that in 1945.
No. Yeah.
But anyway,
That's Europe's MacArthur, but go ahead.
Yeah. No, no, I mean that's what I was going to say
He
is
was
that
better tactically than MacArthur, but yeah.
oh God, yeah. But that's what I was going to say is that the crush
Mhm.
from both sides on Germany is what brought them down faster.
Mhm.
And again, they're a lot of their people are like, this is not working out. And I mean, just look at the numbers of surrenders in 1945 compared to the
Mhm.
Japanese. Not,
Mhm.
not even close.
Yeah.
But
And we're able to divert, as those Germans do surrender, we're able to divert resources from Europe to the Pacific, which is going to help. But until, as we said, we spent 2 episodes on the atomic bomb, folks. If you're interested in that, go back and watch them. I think we did them in season 2. Um,
I don't remember.
it might have even been in season 1. But the point is that until those bombs were dropped, this war was not going to end.
Mhm. Nope.
All
All right,
right.
Bill.
Well, that's all I had, Seth.
Yeah, I think that'll wrap it up, for 1944. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, we could sit here for another hour and debate commanders, and cool innovations and things like that. And maybe we'll do that in the future. But we wanted to kind of tie up 44 here at the end, and kind of thought this was a good. It's easy on us.
Mhm.
We didn't really have to prepare for this at all, which is nice. And
Yeah.
it was fun. I like doing things off the
It
cuff
was
like
too.
this. Yeah,
2 guys sitting at a bar.
that's
But
it.
there was some sad news this week, Seth. What was that?
Indeed, yeah, and I was remiss for not announcing this at the beginning, but yeah, this week, actually yesterday, as a matter of fact, we got word that the last survivor from the USS Arizona, a guy that I knew, a friend of mine, Lou Conter, passed away at the age of 102. So we are recording this on April the 2nd, 2024, and as of yesterday, Lou died. He passed away, and there are no more survivors from the battleship Arizona. It's a sad day in world history, frankly, but
Mhm.
especially military history and American history. Lou was a fantastic guy. He was a good dude. I knew him for several years, and he was just a very, very good man. He'll be missed by his family and friends, and yeah, no more survivors from Arizona.
Yeah, so he was enlisted on the Arizona, as I recall, but
Correct.
wasn't he a Black Cat pilot? And didn't he get shot down twice?
Correct. Yeah.
Once by
Yeah.
us,
Yeah.
once
Yeah.
by the Americans.
Yeah.
I,
He had a very, very interesting naval career. He really did. I
yeah,
think he retired a commander, if I remember correctly off the top of my head.
Lieutenant Commander, I think.
Lieutenant
Yeah,
commander.
yeah.
Um, but
I
he
think
had
he
an
wrote a
amazing
book on
career.
survival after being shot down
Really.
twice.
I don't remember.
Yeah,
It wouldn't surprise me though. Wouldn't surprise me. But incredible guy, very, very nice gentleman, and literally the last of his breed.
absolutely, literally the last of his breed.
Yeah,
That's very sad.
it is. It is. Well, to continue, guys, with this off the cuff stuff, next week we are going to do our first, God help us, Q&A.
I'm
So
looking forward to it.
I am too. I am too. And I want to please understand, guys, we cannot answer every question. I'm just looking at the Facebook responses, and good gravy. If we answered all those questions, we'd be here for 2 weeks doing it all.
Yes.
We're going to pick and choose. It is nothing personal. If we don't answer your question, it's not because we don't like you. I don't even know 99% of you, but we're picking the ones, not the ones that we can answer. We're not picking softballs. We're gonna pick questions that we think are interesting, that we have seen pop up more than once, that maybe
Yeah.
we can
I
kind of
already
answer all
saw.
in one time.
Yeah, I've already seen a few, Seth, that I don't know the answer to. Some I have to do some research.
Yeah, there's a few in there that and I'll say this, there's a few in there that are opinion, like, what do you guys think of this? And we're going to answer some of those, but we're going to try and stay away from most of those, mainly because they're opinions. You know,
And we don't have opinions, right, Seth?
no, not at all. But what do they say
Yeah.
about opinions, So anyway, point being, we're going to try and stick to fact-based questions and give you fact-based answers, and if we
Mhm.
do have an opinion, we will state it as such. But I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be cool. And we may do it again. We probably will do it again, but who knows? Anyway, we'll see. We'll see what happens. But that is next week is our Q&A, and that will be the final episode of this season. Will be next week, Bill. It's been a long season, by far our longest yet,
Sure has.
but it's been the most important year of the war.
Yeah, I think we did. So far, we've done 32 or so episodes this season.
Yeah.
It's 32 weeks of content, folks.
Yeah, that is a lot of writing.
That's a lot. Yeah.
That is a lot of reading. That's a lot of research. That is a lot of writing. I'm here to tell you.
It is. Yeah.
I'm here to tell you. So I look forward to episodes like this where we can just riff right off the top of our head. These are fun.
Me too.
These are fun. All right, Bill, anything else?
That's it, Seth.
All right,
Been a
cool.
good season, folks.
It has. It has. It has indeed. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to look at our YouTube channel, please do so. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. Bill, take us home.
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.